Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and this is the second in our tribute to the late Robert W. McChesney. We have a number of distinguished guests, and I'm pleased to say that the we includes Victor Pickard, who has helped to organize this. And I wonder if I could just throw to you, Victor, to introduce things a bit.
Sure. Thanks, Toby, and thank you for hosting this discussion as we remember Bob McChesney, our friend and colleague. The way that we are organizing these discussions is to first introduce ourselves. We're going to do so alphabetically by our first names. And throughout the discussion, we're going to reflect on Bob's work, on how we knew Bob, perhaps share some entertaining anecdotes. And most importantly, we're going to think about how we can build on Bob's work and carry it forward. So with that said, again, my name is Victor Pickard. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm a professor at University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School, and I'm going to hand it over to Ben Scott to introduce himself.
Thanks, Victor. Pleasure to be here. Ben Scott. I am the CEO at a global nonprofit called Reset Tech and a recovering academic.
Hi, I think I'm next. I'm Deepa Kumar. I am a professor of media studies at Rutgers University. And Victor, it's so sad that the panel that we are on together today and the last panel we were on in Australia was to remember Winnie Moscow. And now we are remembering Bob McChesney. And as these giants in our field leave us, I'm glad we have a chance to think about them.
I echo that. And I'm Des Freedman. I'm a professor of media and communications at Goldsmiths in London.
I am Mandy Troeger. I am currently a Walter Benjamin Fellow of the German Research Foundation at a German university called Tübingen, where I am also actually working as a media journalist. And in that sense, I always think of Bob and his radio show Media Matters, because my op-eds are very similar to actually the Media Matters episodes that I remember very well.
I'm Rick Maxwell. I am a professor of media studies at Queens College and the City University of New York.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sat Jhally. I think it's called Professor Emeritus now at UMass Amherst. I retired a few years ago. I'm also the founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation. And Bob did a lot of work with us and appeared in a lot of our films.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Well, this is like one of those 60s movies when MGM and others were trying to make money by pouring every major star into films. What was one called, Rick? The big yellow Rolls Royce or something?
Yeah, like the Mad, Mad, Mad World kind of thing.
Yeah. But of course, this is a serious time and a sad time, but also a joyous one in that, as Deepa said, on the one hand, it's tragic to be farewelling loved friend, colleague, teacher. On the other, it's great to be able to do so amongst distinguished colleagues. So who'd like to kick us off by saying a bit about how you knew Bob, what you saw as his contribution, and so
on? I'll jump in then, just because it's pretty much exactly 20 years, I think 21 years, since I first nervously, and that's with a capital N, emailed Bob to say, I can't remember, it's obviously to interview him. It was to go over to the US to do research on media policy making and to interview him. And Bob said, this I do remember. He said, we sound like kindred spirits. You must come over, but Ben Scott will take care of you. So he outsourced the hard work, but he welcomed me into the fold very quickly. And he also, and this kind of did change so much of what I have done in the last 20 years, he immediately said, like a proper organizer, he immediately said, you must come to the second national convention for, oh, you'll all have to help me out, media reform, which was in St. Louis. So it was a kind of condition of me meeting him, was that it had to take place at what was an incredible, over-the-top, anarchic, but wonderful media activist experience where he seemed to be just bouncing around. And that, his introduction and that event have absolutely shaped my outlook, not just on media activism, but really on what a media academic should be. There are so many, how do you say it, frustrating people in academia who may say one thing and then not do anything else. And Bob just stood out as the man where thought and deed were intertwined perfectly in a really inspiring way.
So Ben, what was it like nursemaiding Des?
Well, I was one of the easier jobs that Bob gave me over the years. I was Bob's PhD student at the University of Illinois. Came to know him in 2001. I remember very clearly when it was because I was tossed in, as many of us were, as teaching assistants in the first semester of graduate school. And I was teaching on September 11th, 2001. And my students came into class and told me that we better cancel class. And it sticks in my mind because I had gone to the University of Illinois almost by accident. I will confess to being originally the student of one Richard Maxwell at Northwestern University. And when I finished undergraduate, was like many, aimless and uncertain what I should do in the world. I took a road trip to New York City where Rick had recently taken up a job as professor. And we sat down over a few drinks and I told him my sob story of aimlessness. And he said, I think my old friend Bob is teaching at Illinois now. You should go and have a sit down with Bob, read his book. It's just come out. It's called Rich Media, Poor Democracy. I think you'll like it. See what you think about Bob's work. Maybe it's a good idea to go study with Bob. And the rest is history, as they say. I spent several years as Bob's research assistant. I was the original producer on Media Matters, Bob McChesney's WILL AM radio talk show, which some of you appeared on as guests, as I recall. And, he became mentor, friend, teacher, North Star for me in my own intellectual journey, as well as a person making his way in the world. So I owe him a lot.
This is Rick. I met Bob at University of Wisconsin, where I was a graduate student. I think he arrived in like '88 or something. I was already beginning to write my dissertation, and I was connected to a lot of lefties in Madison already. And when I discovered Bob, I asked him to be on my committee, which, as Ben will tell you, he's a tough cookie, and he can really take you to task on the dumbest things that you say. But Bob was I'll just say that I was my advisor on my dissertation was John Fisk. I was surrounded by a lot of cultural studies people. It was really a great oasis for me to have someone to talk to about political economy and structural issues. And in a funny way, by the way, I listened to the recording from yesterday, and there's a lot of good contextualization that your listeners will probably catch up on there. So, but there was some comments made about the idea that Bob was a committed political economist at a time when political economy was fading away. And I think Larry Gross talked about the inability to hire Herb Schiller at Penn, Dallas Mead, et cetera, and they ultimately couldn't hire Bob either at one point. But the conditions for following along a political economic pathway in the discipline and later on with Bob's activism, it just wasn't really ripe for it. And the rest of us who were kind of caught in between could see that there was this, you know, I wouldn't call it a dominant thread in media studies, but cultural studies certainly was, you know, pushing forward. And it was the time, I think, Des, and you all remember this, the debates between political economy versus cultural studies, and it was just ridiculous. You know, but I was kind of the child that caught between the two in a lot of ways. So that's one of the main things to anchor my relationship to Bob. And he was a mentor and very unapologetically socialist. And you know, he would come to, you know, lecture at Northwestern. When I invited him, the first thing out of his mouth was, "I'm a socialist, you know, get used to it. Now you're going to hear my perspective on these issues." So it was really, you know, great, refreshing, and for me, you know, a moment of sanity that was lacking. And I think Des was kind of pointing out this, lacking now in academia. A lot of people just, you know, are not committed at all to anything but their careers.
Yeah, I want to pick up on some of those themes that were just laid out by you and others, to emphasize how Bob was both a scholar of immense stature, but also an academic, right? Which is one foot outside the academy. He was the founder of Free Press, and Des mentioned the Media Reform Conference. And I actually met him at a UDC conference, Union for Democratic Communication. And I believe he was one of the founding members of the UDC to create and that conference is really a space for outside of the ICA for radical scholarship. And I remember reading his work, and, you know, we all know his big books, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, his incredible books with John Bellamy Foster on their critiques of capitalism, neoliberalism. They're from that monthly review tradition influenced by Baran and Sweezy, who articulated a particular notion of monopoly capitalism, and they brought that to the study of the media in a particular way. But to me, what was really powerful about Bob's work was his critiques of the academy itself, right? He's written many essays, including one in Monthly Review, where I believe he was an editor for a while. And I pulled that up in preparation, actually, for this conversation. And I just want to read a passage from that piece, because it's as relevant today as it was back when he wrote this in 1994. Just very broadly, this piece is about radical scholarship in the academy. And his critique is about how cultural studies, while it has produced a lot of fabulous research, has also become a space where people pose as critical communication scholars, but do nothing to actually change the world. And here's how he put it, quote, "Many critical communication scholars have only their most hackneyed notions about the histories of various social movements, labor, socialists, civil rights, feminists, etc., to bring about radical change over the past 200 years. Insofar as the entire purpose of critical work, ostensibly, is not merely to interpret the world, but to change it and to change it radically, this ignorance defies comprehension. I cannot help but roll my eyes when I hear some quote-unquote critical academic dismiss all previous labor and socialist movements as racist or sexist, based at best on anecdotal evidence, when that person has never lifted a finger for social change and probably never will." And that really resonated with me and with, I think, a whole generation of scholars who identified, like Bob did, as Marxists, as socialists, and who wanted to use the privileged position that we had to not only interpret the world, but to act upon it and to change it. And he put the wind under our sails, right? The wind beneath our wings, and gave us the confidence to be both scholars and activists.
Can I add to this? So this is Mandy. I am here, I think, mainly as Bob's former student. In fact, Ben and I, we had the exact same committee, if I remember correctly, which was Bob and Inga Stoll, his wife, Dan Schiller and John Nerone. I was at the University of Illinois from 2009 till 2014, so just before almost everyone retired. And I still think it is such a privilege. Such a privilege that I got to experience this. And what you just essentially described is like the exception to what became my normal in academia is actually the exception, right? Like the kind of research that Bob encouraged us to do is the exception and became my normal because I had this like incredible committee, including Bob McChesney and also Inge Stoll. And I would like to add Inge Stoll to this because to me, they really, oftentimes their activism kind of went hand in hand. I remember them being very active in trying to unionize faculty members at the University of Illinois, and they were very engaged with that. And that kind of support they gave, I mean, so my memories are all like, Bob has been so supportive of my research. Like, I can't really remember him being critical. He would just go like, Mandy, what you're doing is great, just continue doing it. And again, I thought that was normal. And then later on, I realized to get that kind of encouragement to do critical or radical research is really the exception. And it, like now when I teach, I try to kind of do a little bit of that, even though I think I fail probably most of the time. And the third thing I thought about before, you know, in preparation is like what a hard worker Bob was. I was also his research assistant actually for the book Digital Disconnect. And I mean, he would be the first one in the office. He would be the last one to go. He would kind of, I mean, he lived what he did. And I always ask myself if that's healthy. I guess that's not the right question to ask, but like it definitely is inspirational. And I think Bob made everyone think that there's nothing more interesting and exciting than media policy. And I think that's a huge contribution. So it's a huge privilege that I got to experience that.
Sat, I wondered if I could prompt you to pop in here, because the Media Education Foundation, which you founded and which Bob played a part in, seems to me an exemplary instance of trying to meld academia and activism, or perhaps blur the differences. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that and about Bob's contribution.
I met Bob first. I think I was trying to rack my brain, but I think it was in 1996 at the first media reform conference, which was before Free Press. I think this was put on by Alternet at UCLA, and there was a lot of people there. Susan Faludi was there. I believe Gerbner was there. I mean, so that's where I met him first and saw him on a panel with Janine Jackson, actually from FAIR. And we made a connection, and we just connected since then. And I think for me, what drew me to Bob and to work with him was that Bob was, he was a scholar activist who knew how to translate research into a public idiom. Like, I mean, he knew how to translate. That was really the function of the Media Education Foundation, was to take kind of the latest, although the best research, and to translate it for non-specialists. And I mean, and this was, I think, with Bob's background as a journalist. I mean, he was a sports journalist. He wrote music. The first film he did with us, we interviewed him. It was about music, called Money for Nothing, about the political economy of music. And again, that's what his background was. And Bob always knew how to write. I don't think there's one sentence that Bob wrote where I said, I don't have a clue what he's talking about. Like, there's too much jargon in here. That he knew that, what we were talking, that the stuff we were doing was too important to be, read by 6 people in a journal. The more people had to read it than just, than people, and I think he was, in that sense, he was never an academic. I mean, he was always more than an academic. He was a public intellectual in everything that he did, and that's what drew me. So I mean, in addition to the incredible work that he did, and I always was struck by, in terms of political economy, that what Bob really stressed was, I mean, sometimes political economy is just seen as, economics, the organization of media. And what struck me was Bob never forgot the political part of it, and that these two things were so intertwined. And then there had to be an activist outcome to this. This was not pure knowledge. And I think that's why whenever I phoned Bob up, he was like, what do you want? And I needed a blurb for a video, or I needed him to appear in a film. And when I ended up doing two films with him on his books. So we did Rich Media, Poor Democracy, with him actually, and with Mark Crispin Miller before he kind of went off the deep end. And then also Digital Disconnect, which was the last thing that we did with him. And actually, and Bob said to me one time, I think the last time I saw him, I think was at the UDC conference, and I was giving a presentation about MEF, and he said to me, or he said in a talk, he said, more people know me from the video or the films with you than from the books that I've written. And I think that's especially true now with students just, have stopped reading. I mean, you can't even think of giving anyone more than a 10-page article. So I think that's what I mean. With Bob and MEF were very closely connected in terms of the vision we had for what intellectual work could do.
Rick, at this point, can I out you as the inventor of the title "Rich Media, Poor Democracy"?
Well, Bob did already in the introduction to the book, so I was humbled by his noting my effort to provide a framework for the book, because I was one of the manuscript reviewers. Oddly, you feel like I'm not worthy when you're doing some of this stuff. And then, I'm reading the book, which I think was originally called "Which Side Are You On?" And I think Deepa, was kind of looking at that side of Bob where he had this, real devastating critique of academic lefties. And the original manuscript had a big section on that. And I imagined what the book would be like without that section. And I said, just taken together without that section, this is a book about the rich media and how it's impoverished democracy. And so I think he kind of, that is really rare that anybody pays attention to a manuscript reviewer, but I think it provided a structure for the book that actually was pretty instructive. And but he never left that critique of the so-called lefties in the media and communications area. It just was sort of sidelined. And I'll just add that at the time, there were people who came to me to attack John Fisk, and and I was like, the guys on the left, he's just he's one of these culturalists. So so there was a lot of attempts to create divisions instead of trying to lay out a clear path for each side and have some sort of agonistic respect for the other side. So I think that book came out of that particular moment when there was still political economy versus cultural studies debates, and I didn't think I was one that didn't think that was productive, and I tried to write about that at some point.
So I could just say something about that with Bob. I mean, Bob wrote a very ill-tempered article dismissing cultural studies, and my great kind of regret was that he thought cultural studies was the Fiskian cultural studies, right? And he didn't know about not very deeply. He didn't know about Stuart Hall, and where cultural studies really emerged in its debate with Marxism, and the great the policing the crisis, which was this. And in fact, the last time I saw him was at the UDC conference, and I was giving a lecture on MEF, and I kind of thought about, okay, Bob is my audience for this, and I'm going to convince him that by the end of this that there is something in cultural studies that is worth engaging with, and that he needs to engage with not the tradition of fan studies and literary theory, but he needs to engage with with critical cultural studies and the tradition that Stuart at least inaugurated. So I didn't really follow up on this, but I hope you had something to think about afterwards.
But
I think his most devastating.
Like one more thing, just this is purely personal. Rick Maxwell was, you were one of the first people to actually critique my watching is working article.
Yeah.
And it's the first time I've actually been able to interact with you, and thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. It's the first time I've ever had the chance to talk to you too. So not to sidetrack this, but yeah, I'm sorry. I was a very sort of strict Marxist that took you to task on concepts. But I'm looser now, so don't worry.
As you and I both.
Go on, Deepa. Get in there.
Okay, I'll be quick. I mean, I really do agree with that point, Sat, which is the Stuart Hall British Cultural Studies tradition, which absolutely should be embraced and taken seriously. But I think, in this piece and others, his sharpest barbs are probably for the postmodern, wing of cultural studies, which unfortunately was more posture and less substance. And I'll just, say one more thing about Bob, which I forgot to mention how I know him. I met him at a UDC conference, but he was so generous and kind with supporting young scholars who, he thought he could encourage and support. So he published my first book, my dissertation, which was about the UPS strike, in his series at the University of Illinois Press. And it never even occurred to me to shop it around anywhere else, because here was somebody who was publishing this kind of work about class and class struggle and the media and so on, which is largely, even today, illegible in the field of communication. And one more personal point about Bob, he was a workaholic, Mandy, but I got to know him more recently as a friend through my partner, who actually has known him for a very long time. My partner's children, my stepkids and Bob's kids grew up together. And so I've seen that side of him where he's an avid sports fan, always rooting for the Cleveland Browns. They never win, but he keeps rooting for them and watches a bunch of football as well as basketball. He was goofy as a parent with his kids. And he was so kind to my stepkids, treating them like his own kids. And I think, the first time I went to his home in Madison, Inga's home and his home, it was for a dinner party. And I was just struck by the fact that he had 10,000 books. I'm sure he read them all. I mean, he was a towering intellectual, but at the same time, so incredibly humble, right? He was not someone to dominate a dinner conversation. He would just sit and listen. And when invited, he would speak, which is, I think, a rare quality, all too rare a quality. So I'm really grateful I got to see that side of him as well in recent years, as a kind supporter, but also goofy and fun person to be around.
10,000 books and a 200-page CV resume, so he didn't do things by halves. But I wanted to step back. I'm sorry to be boring and move away from the personal, back to the cultural studies element. I mean, at one level, you react to what is in front of you. You don't get to choose, I think, the target of your critique. And I think Bob was 100% right to look at what was in front of him, which was a dominant strand of cultural studies, which I think was, it was very significant and important that he took it on, because it had moved a long way away from some of the concerns of the 1970s British cultural studies theorists. And he was pretty single-minded about it. And I think that is admirable. It doesn't make you narrow-minded. It just makes you fierce. And it's not as if, he was intellectually narrow. I mean, I was always struck by, he seemed to want to put, I don't know, Jefferson into every other sentence. I mean, he had, the historical sweep was immense. And, I as a British academic, I struggled with that. Sometimes here is this self-avowed socialist who, when I invited him to give a talk in London, and he gave me the title, and it was blah, 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 why capitalism is the problem. And at the end of it, in the email, he said, I hope that won't shock people too much. It's like, no, I think we can live with that. That's good. So he had that edge. This is what he was about, an absolute self-declared socialist. But it strikes me that he really loved to go back to 18th century and 19th century democracy. And I would like to ask others in this distinguished panel what they make of that, because I used to struggle with that a bit. You know, my role models were slightly different to those, and it seems to be there was you know, he bounced off, particularly with Tom Paine. If we were asked to identify our heroes, I imagine, and you will correct me if I'm wrong, but Bob probably would have said Tom Paine. I'm wondering if anyone wants to explain more about that.
I can jump in there. This is Ben, and Victor can say a lot about this too. I think you can tell from this conversation that we all experience Bob in different ways as an intellectual. The truth is, he was a polymath. The guy was all over the place, and he had deep expertise in so many different things. I only recognized just what a genius he was later, when I realized most people aren't like that, who have PhD after their name. You know, but he was a historian by training and by preference, and that was his first book was a historical treatment of radio in the 1930s, which to my mind is still the most important history of that period, and hasn't never met its equal. And you know, he always steered me first and foremost to study history and to understand the way in which history could give us insights into the structure of political economy as it rolled forward from the founding of the Republic in the 18th century right up into the 21st century, and that these patterns were repeating. And you could see the logic of capital applied in different media contexts with different technologies rolling through all these historical periods. And it's an insight that shaped my whole career. But he was, I'm pleased to hear that he became a very supportive mentor later. From when I recall as a PhD student, boy, he was tough. Like, I was hazed mercilessly for about 2 years and sent into the dungeons of the bowels of the University of Illinois Library, which, if you've ever been there, is about 20 stories high, broken into these half floors where the ceiling is sort of grazing the top of your head. And he wasn't happy until I came out of there, like, covered in dust and you know, steeped in some obscure piece of media history that he wanted to unearth in order to prove a point. But you know, once you achieved a level of, you know, proving yourself for him that you were a part of this intellectual tradition, he was intensely loyal. He was just a huge-hearted person who he wanted the best for everybody around him. And you know, he brought that to his scholarship, and you know, he brought that to the community that he built.
Can
If
I?
I can,
I'm
sorry,
so
you go,
sorry.
Mandy.
Yeah, okay. Well, then just so I'm also a historian by training, so that might have helped. And I know exactly those dungeons you were talking about. I was there too. I actually enjoyed them. And so I do think I did really only experience him as being very supportive. And I do think also, like, connecting to what Des said, my experience is that of essentially, you know, going back to Germany and then kind of apply what I learned at the University of Illinois, where Bob played a crucial role, in an academic setting that is very different, right? Like, where an understanding of academia, of the field, is very different. And that's what I meant earlier when, you know, the exception to the rule was my normal. And now, you know, I'm thrown into this very different academic landscape and understanding of what academia is. And then also, you know, what history is. So in that sense, I can relate to what Des says, because it is so culturally kind of constructed in a way. And I did always appreciate about Bob his, like, that historical perspective, because I do think in general in the field it's way underdeveloped and we should have it much more. I did want to tell one anecdote, and I wrote that down, and, like, So while I was at the University of Illinois, a graduate student, I worked in an educational project called Education for Justice project, which meant I taught in prison. It was a medium security prison for men. And first I was a tutor, and then I taught a class called Media and Democracy. And of course, I gave students Bob's books. And they ate them up. Like, they were reading them like crazy. They loved those books. And eventually I asked Bob if he wanted to come and give a talk in prison. And Bob didn't hesitate a minute. He immediately, even though he was super, very full schedule, he came and dedicated like this entire evening. It was always like 6 hours. And 3 hours of that, he kind of gave a lecture in prison. And he did not expect what he was going to experience, which was that they had read every word of every page, and they really scrutinized and questioned him on like details. And Bob loved it because I think he experienced it not often enough, maybe. And until like later on, like a few years later, he wrote me an email and still telling me that was like a great experience. So I really appreciated him for also, just being really open-minded and still trying new things, even though he didn't have to. Okay, Victor, thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you, Mandy. I love that story. I've been so enjoying all these stories about Bob. I thought I would just jump in a bit on the experiences of having been also one of his former students. Can also relate to much of what Ben was saying about getting hazed early on. I actually got locked into the University of Illinois library one night doing book research for Bob. It was a very traumatic experience. But I also want to address Dez's question too, that I think is kind of a provocative one, and it speaks to a number of tensions that we might be all grappling with in the academy and outside of the academy today. And as everyone's been saying, there is this popular narrative that the academy's overrun with wild-eyed left-wing radicals, and if only. We all know that it's primarily a liberal institution. It's barely center-left on many issues, and Bob created this intellectual, ideological space for actual radical scholarship, and he gave all of us, especially as students at University of Illinois, a sort of distorted view of what the academy looks like, and what the field of communication is in particular. But one thing that I thought that Bob always tried to do, despite his unapologetic socialism and commitment to radical politics, was to create coalitions with liberals. I mean, in many ways, he never used this phrase, but I would project onto his strategic vision this idea of a popular front, of left wings and liberals, left wingers and liberals linking together, especially around media reform issues. And so he drew inspiration from, yes, people like Thomas Paine, who actually was a radical even by today's standards. But I'd say more specifically, he looked at some of the democratic theorists like Alexander Michaeljohn and C.B. McPherson, and would really try to draw out the best of those traditions to show that if you looked at their work, they were basically saying that a commercial media system was incompatible with democratic society. I mean, there really was a radical critique in a lot of that body of liberal thinking. So in fact, Des, if I remember correctly, he wrote this in an essay for a book that you co-edited on liberalism. And he said something like, when he looks at liberalism, he's a glass half full kind of guy. Like, he sees some potential there that, he thinks we should work with and try to radicalize. So those are just some knee-jerk thoughts. But I think this speaks to, especially as we think now about building on Bob's work and how we can apply it to some of the problems we're dealing with today.
I think that also gets to Des's question, and Des, of course, is one of the few true Americans in this conversation. That gets to Des's question about why Bob would talk about Jefferson et al. And I think it's this. As we all know, there is a semi-reverential way in which many US people speak of the founding parents. Slaveholders, rapists, property holders, all the things that they were. All that said, you can be Barack Hussein Obama II, or you can be Donald J. Trump, and you speak of these people reverentially. what Bob was doing, I think, in part by talking about the founding parents in positive terms, was pointing out that there were, and this gets to Victor's point, very radical elements in what they did, in addition to these appalling atrocities for which they were responsible. One moves on here to think about, for instance, a century later, John Stuart Mill opposing the idea of there being taxes on knowledge. You know, how can we have liberalism if you have to pay money in order to share ideas, promote information, provide knowledge? And similarly, Bob's insistence on thinking of the early forms of subvention of knowledge through, the almost free use of the post office in order to send periodicals across the country, pointing to the fact that socialism is not strange, it's not foreign, it's not new. Look at railway stations, look at post offices, look at the electricity grid, look at all sorts of things that may since have been privatized, but were socialized entities in the United States as elsewhere, in the sense of the sharing of risk across society and also opportunities and benefits. So I think that in addition to whatever may have been his own cathexis onto Paine or Jefferson, however critical that cathexis may have been, he was also making a smart political point, which is to say, this is not about some funky 20th century German revolutionary feminist. This is about the heritage that you all valorize. So I think it was a real and remains a really smart political point.
Yeah, could I just jump in? I think that's absolutely right. I think when I think of Bob, I think of him, he's an American scholar. And I think what he wanted to say was that this project that he's involved in is a very American project. This isn't some weird thing coming over from Europe or from outside, that there's a tradition, radical tradition within America. As you said, tied up with all kinds of other horrible things. But this is internal. There is an internal logic, not logic to this, but there's a history to this, like, as you said, like with the post office. And even in my classes, I teach the 1928 Communications Act. And I remember Bob saying, like, this was the key moment when, we decided that we were not going to be, the media was not going to be democratic, but they were going to be commercial. And you can't understand anything until you go back to the late 1920s and see the debates that took place at that time, in which there were serious debates about having a public broadcasting system, not as a kind of narrow thing, but as part of a mixed economy. I think it was largely strategic and political, but I think he was an American. This was an American project that I think he really believed in.
I think that's exactly right, Seth. And I think I remember he often invoked Fighting Bob La Follette as a hero of his and as a kind of image in which he saw himself. Fighting Bob, for those of you who don't know the reference, was a progressive era politician from Wisconsin who was not just a radical organizer and a successful builder of the Popular Front in the Midwest in the 1920s and teens, but also a very powerful congressional leader and in Washington. And McChesney was, in my experience, this very unusual mix of a radical thinker, but a very pragmatic political actor. When I got into politics, after graduate school and worked with Bob for many years, and he would come to Washington, I never had to tell him, hey, tone it down, buddy, on the anti-capitalism thing. We're going to see some Republicans here. He needed no guidance. He knew exactly how to communicate radical ideas in the language that people needed to hear it in. And it's one of the things I admired most about him is he could extemporaneously speak on these topics in paragraphs with clear ideas and bullet points off the top of his head and string together a complex argument in a way that you could understand whether you were a peer as a scholar or whether you were hearing it for the first time as a congressional staffer. And, when I was trying to write my dissertation, I needed a little extra money to get by, I'd moved to the Washington, D.C. area where my wife was studying at University of Maryland. And I talked to Bob and I said, look, I'm broke and I need to pay rent. Is there anybody you know in the D.C. area that can get me a research assistantship? And he called me back the next week and he said, well, I couldn't find anybody who wanted a research assistant, but a friend of mine is a congressman and he needs a legislative aide. Why don't you go up to Capitol Hill and do some work on policy and help him construct a communications agenda on broadcast policy? And I said, Bob, I don't know anything about that. You had me studying the 1920s for the last 4 years. I don't know anything about contemporary communications policy. All I know is what I've read in classes. And he said, that doesn't matter. They don't know what they're doing either. And you just make it up as you go along. And before long, you'll be better than the rest of them. And I said, well, who is it that you want me to work for? He said, oh, you probably never heard of him. He's a congressman from Vermont called Bernie Sanders. And Bob had personal friendships with a number of members of Congress, not just Bernie, but also Sherrod Brown, Tammy Baldwin, all of whom went on to become obviously very prominent leaders in the progressive political movement. But at the time, I just knew them as friends of Bob. Didn't seem at all out of the ordinary to me.
I mean, I'll be honest, there was a part of that makes me uncomfortable in the same way that Des raises these theories, which is, do we really want to be friends with Democratic Party people when we know that they are a capitalist party, after all? And, Bob was actually involved in a number of political movements. He was very active in the 2000 campaign for Nader, stepping outside of the two-party system. But in 2020, he was heavily involved in Bernie's campaign. In fact, he named one of his cats Bernie 2020. And this is the one time I did have a debate with him. He was quite confident that Bernie would win. And I said, I will bet you 5 crackers that are on this table, but that's not happening. I never collected. But I will say this, which is that just like Ben, I'm nevertheless grateful that he knew these people, because when I was, at that time, I was the president of our union as well, Rutgers AUPAFT, and we had just taken a strike vote. 95% agreed to go on strike for a really intersectional set of demands, not just bread and butter class issues, but also gender and race equity. And the problem was this was a sleepy union that had only recently, in 4 or 5 years before this, actually woke up to its own power. And we knew we had the capacity for just a 1 or 2 day strike, and that potentially, if we did go on strike, we could lose what we've already won at the bargaining table. So I thought, you know what, some of us got together and said, how can we bring more pressure on the administration? And we came up with the idea of getting Bernie Sanders to come to our picket line should we go on strike. And I thought Bob is the person to get in touch with. And he immediately put me in touch with Bernie's people who committed to it. And then we could do psychological warfare to say, should we go on strike? Bernie Sanders will be out there and this will become a national story. So, hey, Rutgers, your public image, universities are very conscious of their public image, will be ruined by this. So I'm uncomfortable at the same time. I'm glad. And I think there's probably a division of labor here between who does what in what spaces.
I wanted to ask people about, some of the costs that can come to one's career as an activist because of being an academic, or one's career as an academic because of being an activist, particularly when words like socialist are thrown around in a context such as the United States. It was mentioned en passant, as Thomas Paine's Birthland would put it, earlier, that Bob only just scraped tenure at Madison. And I mentioned in the podcast we did yesterday that I was on a professional association committee where one of Bob's publishers had proposed Rich Media Poor Democracy for the Best Book Award. And I was outvoted by a thumping majority on the grounds that this wasn't scholarship, this was activism, it wasn't rigorous.
I'm not sure exactly what your question is aiming to get out of us, but I can tell you that my commitments to Marxism and I mean, you know, I went into a class at Northwestern and I was reminded of this by a former student who now is a pretty well-known sociologist in Spain, that the first thing I said was, look, I'm a Marxist-Leninist and I'm going to approach the analysis, I think it might have been some advanced political economy thing, with these ideas that there's a role for the state and, you know, we're going to have, you know, that link with policy and activism. It didn't do me any good for my my career at Northwestern. And as some of you know, I didn't get tenure there, but you know, I did hear anecdotes that on my way out, some of the people who voted against me said, "We'll never hire another Marxist again," and in a proud kind of way, like, you know, there was a purge. So, you know, and I think you know, Ben was a student of mine at Northwestern in an undergraduate political economy class, but we had political economy there because Manjunath Pendakur put that class in the curriculum, and they hired me, and I took it over and, you know, developed more of the curriculum that I could. And then when I went to Queens College and City University, New York, one of the first things I did was to create a political economy class for undergraduates. So, you know, fuck them, and I'm going to continue to, you know, do what I'm doing, but I'm also going to be much more cautious about the, you know, the two-facedness of academic colleagues, and, you know, try to protect myself. And, you know, that you know, that experience is it shaped me for a long time, and, you know, so I'm still kind of iffy on the whole academic thing. I don't know, you know, now I claim I'm an accidental academic, that I just kind of fell into it, but I'm not confused about where I stand politically. And Toby and I, when we met in 1995, I think I shocked. What you might want to tell that anecdote, because I can't remember my own. I was so angry at everybody. So maybe you can tell that story, Toby.
Well, this is where we say that Rick and I met at Harvard Law School, which is because Tom Streeter brought together a group of people because there was briefly a kind of leftist formation at Harvard Law School, the two Kennedys and others that people may know about, that enabled enough funds to bring people together. And we were all supposed to introduce ourselves. Some of the people who were there turned out either to be or to become very famous. And then there were the also-rans like me. But anyway, when we were introducing ourselves, Rick said to this group of people, almost none of whom he would have met, "Is anybody else here a socialist?" And, you know, I'd only been living in the United States a year and a half or something, and it just set my little heart aflutter. I put my hand up. Rick put his hand up. Maybe Mike Curtin put his hand up.
Paula Chakravarti put her hand up too.
Then Paulina Chakravarti put her hand up, but not too many others. And it struck me as a brassy thing to say. And in my 25 years living in the United States, mostly as a foreigner, when I occasionally would go to vaguely shishi dinner parties in New York or LA, the two cities I lived in, I would keep a lid on my socialism when I was amongst people who loved the New York Times or worked for NPR, who were liberal Democrats. And on the one occasion I didn't, I went off the leash and I couldn't stop babbling socialism. I destroyed the dinner party. Nobody else spoke to me. I wrote a thunderous apology to all concerned afterwards.
Well, I mean, there's a contradiction, I guess, we have to deal with, which is that I don't think socialism and activism are the key ingredients for promotion because of the culture that exists for many of us. But the contradiction is that if we want to change that culture, we have to be a socialist and an activist, because liberalism is not going to do it for us. And I am assuming that we are seeing this times 100 at the moment in the US, but we're also seeing this in Britain. And I've had personal experience of this. So, and again, I'm bringing it back to Bob. I mean, Bob created the spaces. He was part of a movement. He saw what I must admit, I really loved in St. Louis at the Media Reform Conference. It was mayhem. It was connected to social movements for all the good and the not so good because of the messiness. And then there was this one meeting, I think, which is for academics. and it was in this tiny room. There weren't even that many people there. And it felt so great because it was a bit like, you are the least important people here. Actually, it's the social movement. You know, it was the anti-racist movement. It was the union movement, the labor movement figures. They were dominating everything. And that was wonderful. And you know, despite, and I think all of you have said that Bob's tradition was very much in, you know, it's a US focused tradition. And I think that does raise some really interesting political issues because, you know, Toby, going back to what you're saying about, you know, the history of socialized areas. Well, socialized is not the same as socialist. There are all sorts of contradictions here. You know, his references were still different. You know, there wasn't a lot of Gramsci or Marx in what he was doing, but my God, the rage and the anger and the social movement activism was there. So these are big debates. We don't have to put him on a pedestal that we can't reach. I'm happy that he is on a pedestal, but we can reach him and we can, you know, feel the inspiration and also have some of those debates. So, you know, to take it back, you know, he showed that you can do amazing work and you can touch the lives of many, many people, even if there may be costs that some of us have had to pay. Well, you know, we will find a way to live with them because there are bigger issues at play.
And Toby, it's interesting you asked this question now because, I mean, given what's happening with Palestinian activism and many things, I mean, these are real issues, and you know, where you really have to think about, like, what are you going to say, and could it cost you your job? I mean, I think it's always been the case. I mean, going back to Bob, I remember I had a conversation with Bob. I think it was around 2014, 2015, because I was saying I wanted to do a film on the way in which the media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was so controlled by the Israel lobby. And there were problems with how you would do that. And I remember Bob saying that if you're in a position to do it, you have to do it. Okay, there may be costs, and some of those costs may be professional, they may be personal. But what's the point of not doing it? Like, if you're in a position to do it, I mean, it's different now. I mean, at that point, it wasn't, no one was going to, come and take you away and lock you up. Well, that might be the case now. They could actually come and, take and lock you up. And so the issues have been heightened. And what I always tell people, around this stuff, I just say, unless you have tenure, you shouldn't even talk about this stuff. The risks are too great. But for those people that do have tenure, it is your responsibility to talk about this stuff. And there may be costs to be paid, but I think there is enough of a kind of liberal tradition within the university that those may even be protected. And I think we're right in the middle of that right now. And I think if Bob was in this conversation, I think that's what he said. He said, look, for those who can do it, you have to do it. You have to say what no one else can say, because there is no other option. But don't say it if it's going to cost you. Don't say it if you're a graduate student. Don't say it if you're a foreign graduate student. Don't say it if you're untenured. Don't say it. Right? And so you have to make these kind of political decisions that are intellectual, intellectual and academic at the same time. And that's the situation we're in right now. And obviously it's real.
Yeah, thank you for raising the question of Palestine, Sat, and thank you for your incredible videos on how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is covered. I use them routinely in my class, as do others, as well as other panels you've organized on this. No doubt you have faced flack. And, thank you for that work. I mean, I bring that up because that is the sharp edge of the spear right now, isn't it? Which is that higher education is being attacked and devastated with phony charges of anti-Semitism, right? Being brought by people like Trump, who has absolutely no interest in fighting anti-Semitism, which is very real and which is on the rise. I mean, think about the Charleston, protests and how people from the right were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And Trump comes out and says, "These are fine people," right? And so it's unfortunate that within the liberal academy, this has become a way in which to actually pry open the resistance to a Trump agenda by allowing for the kind of crackdowns that are happening, and to see Columbia University cave in the way that it has, to see NYU denying a diploma to the young person who gave this fantastic speech, Logan Rosas, about the genocide and the starvation that's going on in Palestine, the Gaza Strip right now. To be denied their diploma is devastating. And I think you're absolutely right that those of us with the privilege of tenure have an obligation to speak out and to protect all those who are risking their lives almost, their futures in doing what they're doing right now.
Can I speak to that? Not to the American or US American context, but like being in Germany, and also, living in the UK. I was recently on a panel at the National Communication Association, the German one, that was dedicated to the role of communication research, the field, in connection to the war in Gaza happening, because there is essentially, this field is silent in Germany, and the question is why. And part of that discussion spoke to what we were just talking about. When do you speak up? Like, when do you speak up? Should you? Of course you should speak up when you have tenure, make use of the tenure. But what do, junior faculty members, what do they do? What do students do? How do they deal with it? And is it good enough to wait for tenure to speak up? And I argued against that, knowing that I don't have tenure. And like knowing that has real consequences for me and for many, many others. And then the question is, how can you still speak up? And I think that's something that Bob, through his scholarship, I don't have a choice. Like, I cannot make myself be quiet, and I cannot make myself not think and not see. And then the question is, how can you do it in a different way, maybe? And then, like, one thing, regardless, what exactly we're talking about, but I think networking and like building networks, like UDC, for instance, in Germany, we have something similar, where I'm active in it. Kind of finding like-minded critical scholars, not just in communication research, but across different fields, who share your thoughts and ideas, where you can have these conversations, and maybe like waiting for tenure, maybe that's just not going to happen. But that's, at least in my perspective, not a good enough reason to not speak out. So I'm very grateful for like the few scholars in Germany who have been speaking out, and who are like very thoughtful, and critical. But I think it's a minority, and that's why maybe it needs more, so junior people, whatever, I'm old, but I'm still considered junior, to do that, and to find new ways of doing that, maybe. And that is really something that I'm grateful to have learned from my entire committee, actually.
I want to say in the discussion in yesterday's podcast, it came up at the end. There was one point where the folks that were speaking yesterday on the podcast said, "Well, what would Bob do?" And I think that was an interesting, to imagine what the Bob that we know, what would he do? And I was thinking about that, around these issues as well. But I have a very specific situation in the City University of New York. We're unionized, and we have this, institutional condition that protects the speech of untenured faculty. And, Northwestern was a meritocracy. So, there were guys washing the dean's car to get bonus points and raises. But, when you have, a union to support the academic speech and the conditions, you have this institutional strength that you feel that you don't feel when you don't have that kind of support. And I know some of you work with the AAUP and others, but our union is actually a pretty radical one. And I've always felt like, while they're telling us we can't have demonstrations here or there, and we have to let them know when we're going to have these meetings, the union said, screw you. We already have rules that allow us to do all of this stuff. So we were able to push back in a larger institutional way. So I think Bob would say, organize. That's what Bob would do. But that institutional connection is something that we don't have protect us. And I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
I think it's again an interesting point when you've raised the issue of the academy and activism and social movements, etc. The academy, at least in the US, I'm not sure in other places, but in the US, as a result of the encampments and as a result of the pro-Palestinian activism, this is the main focus of contestation now, and it kind of refers to how important the intellectual function is for the elite class. That there's the CEO of Palantir Technologies, they're the AI company that has been doing all the targeting in Gaza. He's a guy called Alex Karp, and he was on a panel about a few months ago, and he said, we think of the encampments as a sideshow. They are not the sideshow. They are the show. Because if we do not win this intellectual battle, we will not be able to deploy armies anywhere. And I think that's the reason why the academy has become the place of contestation around this, because it is now clear that they're losing the elite class. I think they've lost the intellectual battle already, which is why the power of the state is being used in this way. And again, a very good question. What would Bob say? And I think you're absolutely right. Bob would say this is actually an incredible, it's a moment of danger, but also a moment of great opportunity, because we onto the center stage.
Sorry, Sat. This also takes me back to debates about 1968, Tlatelolco, Prague, Berkeley, Paris, you name it. And the notion that was all a comprehensive failure, right? The connection between the industrial proletariat and the student class didn't amount to anything. The Prague Spring was destroyed. The Tlatelolco massacre put everybody in jail who wasn't killed or disappeared, etc. Right? We're all familiar with that and how it becomes both a romanticization of that legacy and also a sense of trauma surrounding it. But another way of looking at it is to say, yes, in some sense, the battle was lost in terms of seizing political economic power. But look at what happened in libraries, in schools, in universities, and the efflorescence not only of some of the spirit of 68, but of the new left and then the new social movements. 19th century feminism's legacy, 20th century feminism's legacy, all the intersectional analysis, and how in liberal universities, these have become the crux of a lot of what goes on. Not so much in the business school, not so much in engineering, places like physics and chemistry, all the Reds were kicked out in the United States in the 50s and so on. But there is a remarkable success story there. And what's happened is that the right, and not only in the United States, but through their loose atlas group of think tanks around the globe, especially in Western Europe, have coalesced in realizing those bastards won in the wash-up of 68, we've got to destroy them. And their documentation right around the world is absolutely clear on this point. You can see it in Project 2025. They lost to environmentalists, feminists, anti-racists, anti-colonialists, and they know it. And so this is their revenge, but it's not just revenge in the childlike way of the orange comb over or the man-child. This is not just revenge, but the real replacement, where they're going to displace those, in my opinion, triumphs of the last 60 years as fast and as profoundly as possible.
Well, I agree with that, but I'm now genuinely thinking, and I would look to others on this panel about what would Bob do. I don't think Bob would be thinking strategically just about the university. I mean, his scope was so much broader. And there's a bit of me that just thinks, to the extent that universities are just, liberal culture in universities is being so overwhelmingly attacked and, in a terrifying way, it doesn't mean that the solution is going to come from inside. I mean, full credit to each and every encampment. There's been 2 encampments set up this week in the UK, pro-Palestine encampments, which is wonderful, and give them all my support. But we need to think beyond the university, even if we're going to rescue the university. So once again, I think, what would he do? I'm sure he would have either done himself, or he would have got a grad student to do a really meticulous and ambitious political economy with a content analysis of media coverage of Palestine. But he would also have said that the grains of resistance are to be found in the kind of movements we have which are pro-Palestine, and that they need to link up with other movements. And I think, again, that is an inspiration. I take from him, that in 2 weeks' time, we have, with the Media Reform Coalition, we have our annual Media Democracy Festival. This is an absolute rip-off. Sorry, Ben and Victor. Well, I'm not that sorry, but it's a complete rip-off of Free Press's conferences. We're still doing them because it's where we can bring, there's an infrastructure of academics, but it's bringing together people from all sorts of different movements. We're going to have an amazing panel on Palestine, as well as on the new McCarthyism and on startup journalism and all sorts of things. And that's the point. I mean, we want to change the media, but we're not going to change the media from inside. And I think it's the same with universities as well.
I'd be curious what Victor thinks about this, because he and I studied with Bob in relatively the same era, and with the caveat, it's been a lot of years since I spent time on campus, and I knew Bob's role as an academic and as a campus politiker only when I was a student. But my memory of it is that he'd had very little time for it. He was by no means the most left-wing person in the department, and was pretty disdainful of the kind of loopy philosophical brand of cultural studies that he felt was navel-gazing nonsense and missing out on the real show of activism and political change. But he also had no time for the sort of corporatist administrators who were just punching tickets and getting their tuition fees and didn't really care whether the kids learned anything in the classrooms. And he was a bit iconoclastic and held himself apart from the department, and notoriously never showed up at department meetings or did the things you do to maintain collegiality. He didn't do any of that stuff. And as a result, he had very few students. He was really doctrinaire. He was focused on his own stuff. And if you got in his world, it was amazing, but he was pretty closed off to that world in those days, at least. And, it's not an accident that I didn't go into academia. Even though that was my plan, I can see in hindsight that he sort of shaped my career trajectory into politics, into a more practical form. Maybe because he thought I was a crappy scholar, but I like to think it's because he wanted more of that in the legacy of his ideas, and he always counseled me to think big about this sort of popular front idea that Victor was referring to earlier, and the link up with the labor movement and the historical base of political power for the working class and for regular folk, and to think not about how to communicate radical ideas in the form of high theory, but to do so in whatever means were necessary in order to communicate with the people you wanted to recruit into your movement. Very practical, very pragmatic, but I don't mean that in a way that he was compromising of his ideals, not at all. He was ferocious in his defense of his ideals, and sort of disarmingly fast and devastating in his sort of repartee and argumentation with people who would challenge him and the basis of his thinking, even on the most mundane questions. So I think he would have had an enormously strong role in this debate on campuses today, but I think he would have seen it as a public role rather than as a as a campus intervention.
Yeah, I agree with that, Ben. I'll just add a couple of notes to that. An interesting change that happened in his own strategizing when I first got to Illinois. If you remember, Ben, up until roughly 2003, he almost had a vanguardist approach in where he was going to try to cultivate some radical scholars and send them out to various departments and take them over slowly. But that changed in 2003 when the media reform movement started blowing up and he was creating free press. And the moment he saw an opening outside of the academy, I completely agree. I mean, he generally was very dismissive of academic politics. He just didn't suffer fools anywhere, whether it was in academia or outside of it. But he certainly would now counsel us to focus on organizing, yes, but making those connections to other social movement groups, trying to create a social base, trying to plan for what hopefully will be political openings in a few short years. I mean, the neoliberal project, I think we would all agree, is dead. So what comes out of the wreckage? And I think he would see opportunity for creating a more socialistic, society, but we're going to have to be ready for that moment ahead.
I mean, there's a difference. I mean, the department is not the place to organize. Like one of the great pleasures I've had since I retired is I don't have to go to any more committee meetings or faculty meetings and listen to people who, I mean, and so that's not where that's not, I don't think that's the site of activism. But I think the university as a whole, not just individual universities, but the academy as a whole has been now thrust into this. And I think we are the kind of leading edge of not just what's going on in the academy, but this is a broader social movement. And I think it's grown out of the George Floyd stuff, the Black Lives Matter stuff, all that stuff. There is, I don't see this as simply about what universities can do, but the universities are now the leading edge of what is permissible to say in the society as a whole, and that's why the fight matters. So I absolutely agree. I'm glad to hear that Bob had no time for departmental, departmental. I was going to say idiots, but colleagues. But the academy, though, is it's a unique place where ideas still are supposed to matter and where we can have some kind of impact. And I think it's still worth fighting over. And even since I've retired, I'm actually more involved in the intellectual life of the university than I ever was before, in terms of organizing speakers that come in and organizing panels on a much, much broader basis.
Well, folks, unless there are last words, that seems like a pretty good place to stop. Deepa.
Last words. I do want to bring together what you, Toby, and you, Sat, just said, which is that even while we organize outside of the university, it is still important to stop the destruction of the university, right? And I think the points that you made, Toby, about the 1960s and the various people's movements, I mean, this comes on the heels of anti-colonial movements from India to Algeria, which are successful in building a kind of internationalism, right? Third worldism in a certain kind of way. In the United States, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, the anti-war movement, all of that. It's about destroying that entire vision. And that's been articulated at least since the 1970s, right? Because the leading edge of all of this was anti-capitalist. It was bringing all these structures into an understanding of how capitalism creates these multiple forms of oppression. And whether you're talking about the Powell Memo or Samuel Huntington's contribution to the Trilateral Commission, the so-called crisis of democracy, it was about how the university produces the ideas and often the activists, such as SDS or various other activists and so on, and destroying that was necessary to assert neoliberal power and dominance. And as we enter an authoritarian fascist era, not just, in the United States, but around the world, and people like Viktor Orban and Modi, all of whom have been given a boost by the election of Donald Trump, right? Because what happens in the United States is very important in terms of setting the terms of what is acceptable elsewhere. It's important to see this agenda, the attack on the university, as part of an overall attack on what they're calling DEI, but it also means oppression in various forms. And so we should stand up for the university. We should organize for academic freedom, and we should organize for work that actually helps explain the world and that helps fuel activism. And I think in doing so, I would just add that we need to have a very sort of compassionate and mindful and humble approach to how we do this. Honestly, even though I've been an activist in so many movements over the last 30 years, I can't say I know the answers. And I think we have a lot to learn from this young generation that is standing up despite the stakes of, standing up, and bring, sort of understanding to different approaches that different people have. I mean, I'm glad we spoke about what would Bob do, but what Bob does is one thing. What other people are doing are other things, and they're all equally valid, because we need to be part of the resistance against this kind of end times fascism, if you will, and do whatever we can in a way that's not combative with each other, but that raises each other up in a sort of understanding that we have a division of labor and we're all fighting against this authoritarian trend.
I want to say one other thing about sort of building on Bob's legacy and what I think he'd be working on now if he were writing another book. And that's what it always shocked me about how he could see around the corners, but he had a knack for predicting where things were headed at the intersection of media and democracy. And if you go back and you read Digital Disconnect now, you think, oh yeah, like guy nails it. Like this is a great analysis of the concentration of power that big tech have now brought to bear over information markets and how it's poisoned democratic discourse. He wrote that book in 2008, and the research started in 2006, at a moment when that was the heyday of Obama progressive use of technology as the liberalizing, democratizing force that was going to escape from the concentrated power of broadcasting cable. If you go back and read People Get Ready, which I think is one of his most brilliant books, even though it's, I think, not widely read, and is a kind of very popular style, not aimed at a scholarly audience. Some really brilliant ideas in there that later become very commonplace in the thinking about the evolution of technology. So I think what he'd be looking at now is the relationship between the concentration of power in AI, the tech oligarchs that are in the inner circle of the Trump political movement, and the reason why this rise in authoritarianism is linked to these developments in technology and information markets, and to try to unpack that in order to plot a course about how you undo that and how you put control over information production and distribution back in the hands of the people. And not to put the genie back in the bottle, but to anticipate a market structure that could actually work for healthy democracy. And, I think we're poorer for it that we don't have his thinking on that, but I take it as a challenge that we all ought to put our minds to such a task, because I think that's where he would be.
Well, folks, I do, for the umpteenth time, I think that's a good point to stop. I thank you all for your both informative and inspirational words. I found it very uplifting. And it was great to hear the stories of people ducking their heads from the beams in the University of Illinois library. I take it none of you are in the library that's actually underground. That's more the wheat library, I think, at the U of I. But those stories, whether you were pushed in there or whether you were scraping around there for whatever reason, through to his influence internationally, despite his being, in inverted commas, an Americanist, and of course to his work with the Free Press, the New Press, the New Media Movement, the Media Education Foundation, you name the acronym or organization. But he helped to make all of them richer in certain ways, whether he was a point of origin or a contributor. So it was great to have so many varied thoughts about his legacy and his impact on all of us, and also to think through in interesting, albeit provisional ways, the kind of question of what would Bob do? And I'm going to get t-shirts made for all of you. Just write to me with your preferred size and design with that on it. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks.